Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy, where today, in the second part of our series on the Jeffersonian Era, you're going to learn about the major events, the causes, and the outcomes of this sometimes forgotten war. In previous lessons, we learned about how George Washington warned in his farewell address to stay out of foreign alliances and entanglements, as well as the evils of political parties. However, as war gripped Europe, political parties, which had quickly established, chose sides between the British and the French. Early attempts to negotiate a stop to British interference in our trade, such as Jay's Treaty, have been a failure, and as war in Europe set off, competition for American supplies would lead to heavy tensions between America and both the British and French. We also learned about the tensions between the Native American tribes of the Northwest Territory and white settlers who continued to pour into the area. And those events set up our lesson today on the War of 1812 and its consequences and outcomes of this often unfamiliar conflict. So, what do you need to know? Well, for most U.S. history classes, as we said, you will need to explain the causes and consequences of the War of 1812. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video, or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. So it's important to remember how events in Europe impacted the War of 1812. By 1803, Britain and France were engaged in the Napoleonic Wars. The British and French were enemies in Napoleon Bonaparte's series of wars to conquer much of Europe. Despite trying to stay neutral, France and England desperately tried to stop American supplies from reaching each other's ports. The British enacted a series of laws known as the Orders of Council, forbidding any neutral country, like the U.S., from trading with France. They ordered ships to blockade ports in search of goods headed for France. One of the policies that we touched on last time that most infuriated the Americans was the British policy of impressment. British ships would stop American vessels looking for English sailors. It was often difficult to tell who was English and who was American, so thousands of U.S. sailors were forced off of their ships and onto British naval vessels, where they were forced to serve in the British Navy. In June of 1807, the British warship, the HMS Leopard, attacked and boarded a U.S. frigate, the USS Chesapeake, looking for British deserters off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. 4 sailors were removed, and 1 was hanged. The attack and firing on an American ship sailing just off of American soil outraged many in the country. We discussed last time how Jefferson passed the Embargo Act of 1807, refusing to buy or sell goods to foreign countries, especially the British and French. Unfortunately, this mostly hurt American businessmen and farmers, and the French and British barely noticed the embargo. Without shipping, merchants, traders, sailors, dockhands, and all kinds of Americans were out of work as a result of this war. Naturally, the economy of the United States suffered. The Federalists hoped that the unpopularity of the Embargo Act would help them capture the presidency. While Federalist Charles Pinckney captured most of New England, the rest of the country voted for Madison. After all, Madison was seen as a continuation of Jefferson. Unfortunately for Madison, this was not an easy time to take control of the presidency, as tensions in the U.S. were high. Madison and Jefferson had one of the great political partnerships in U.S. history. Even before serving as Jefferson's Secretary of State, the two had helped create the Democratic-Republican Party. One of Madison's first issues was dealing with the Native Americans in Ohio. They were frustrated that white settlers continued to pour into their lands that they had been promised in previous treaties. The natives, under the leadership of Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, turned to the British in Canada for assistance. Tecumseh and his brother, known as the Prophet, with a name that I will not try to pronounce, gained a following and established a confederacy of other tribes. They set up a base in Indiana near the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers called Prophetstown. Their goal was to stop the spread of whites into their territories with the help of the British. American Governor William Henry Harrison, a future president, attacked the camp, driving the natives from their land. Despite losing many U.S. soldiers, Americans considered this battle a victory. However, Tecumseh was not present, surviving to join the British to continue harassing the Americans. On a side note, Harrison's victory at Tippecanoe would later help boost him, with his vice presidential candidate John Tyler, to the presidency with the catchy campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler Too. Elected in 1840, he would serve for only 31 days before dying of pneumonia. Back in Washington, many Americans accused the British of instigating the native attacks in Ohio, including what were called the War Hawks in Congress, such as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, two of the most famous congressmen in U.S. history. The War Hawks, in a display of nationalism, were in search of new lands, and southern Canada and the West were seen as prime targets. The War Hawks called for an increase in military spending and prepared America for war. The British, busy in their own war against the French, decided to back down. In June, a new prime minister took over and repealed the Orders of Council, which would stop the practice of impressment in an attempt to improve relations with America. Unfortunately, the news arrived 3 weeks too late, and by then the U.S. had already declared war. That June, the U.S. Congress declared war for the first time in U.S. history. Federalists were very much opposed to the declaration of war, especially in New England. The vote for war was declared with one of the smallest margins in U.S. history. Northern states feared the effects that it would have on their trade. So let's review why the U.S. declared war. First was the impressment of American sailors. Remember the Chesapeake. Second was the Native American attacks aided by the British. And finally, they were just sick of British interference with American trade. The U.S. Army, once again, was definitely unprepared for war with the mighty British military. The U.S. Army had a small, untrained force of less than 12,000 men, many of whom were new recruits. So they often relied on state militias with poorly trained troops. Sounds a little bit like the Revolutionary War. Military campaigns in the war would focus on three fronts: the Atlantic Ocean, Canada, and the South and Southwest. The first campaigns were against Canada. Much of the U.S. strategy was to attack Canada, thinking the Canadians would join them in throwing out the British. In July, General William Hull marched from Detroit into Canada, where he met Tecumseh and the British. He quickly retreated and surrendered Detroit, as his troops reported that he was scared to death of being savagely tortured by the Native Americans. Hull's defeat would be one of many failed attempts to capture parts of Canada for the Americans, ending a dream that Canada might actually want to become part of the United States. However, there was a bright spot for the Americans, and that was at sea. Americans had gained valuable experience in the Barbary Wars and the Quasi-War with France. The naval frigate, the USS Constitution, destroyed 2 British vessels early in the war, boosting American morale and earning it the nickname Old Ironsides. The greatest naval victory came under an officer named Oliver Hazard Perry, who defeated and captured 6 British vessels in the Battle of Lake Erie, where he forwarded his famous report, quote, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Americans also attacked York, which is present-day Toronto, burning the Parliament. And this attack gave the British an idea for some payback, which we'll see about in a minute. With Lake Erie controlled by the U.S., the British and natives tried to retreat from Detroit, where they were met by General Harrison. In the bloody Battle of the Thames that resulted, Tecumseh was killed. Before his death, Tecumseh had traveled America, trying to unite different native tribes, one of which was the Creeks. In March of 1814, having lost their British allies, Andrew Jackson slaughtered around 550 Creek Indians in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The Creeks and many Midwestern tribes would be forced off their lands as a result. Andrew Jackson, the quote, hero of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, would go on to gain a reputation as one of the ultimate Native American fighters. He would also go on to become president, where his harsh policies against the natives would continue. However, he wasn't done in this war. So we already see one of the outcomes of this war. The Native Americans were the ultimate losers in the War of 1812. Like the French and Indian War, they lost their European ally, and ultimately much of their land. Meanwhile, by 1814, the French had begun losing in Europe, and the British could focus on America. That spring, they invaded Washington, D.C., and set fire to the White House and the Capitol. Payback, as some would say, for the invasion of York. A month later, they moved on to Baltimore, where soldiers at Fort McHenry kept the British from capturing the city. American Francis Scott Key, watching the battle as a prisoner on a British ship, and seeing that, quote, our flag was still there the day after the attack, Key penned the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. By 1814, both sides were growing weary of the war, and New England Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut, known as the Hartford Convention, to discuss seceding or pulling out of the U.S. and put together a list of grievances. This meeting was seen as unpatriotic and would lead to the party's downfall, especially when the tide of the war changed. In September 1814, the British marched south from Canada to attack Plattsburgh, New York. The U.S. stopped the campaign with the Battle of Lake Champlain, convincing the British that the war was too costly. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814, bringing an end to the war. Despite not addressing the concerns of the Americans, their new standing had become clear. Unfortunately, for many British soldiers, the signing of the peace treaty took a few weeks too long to arrive in America. The most famous battle of the war was fought after peace had already been declared. The Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. Led by Andrew Jackson, was an overwhelming victory for the U.S., one that would make Jackson a national hero and launch him to the presidency. So, what are the outcomes of the War of 1812? Well, again, the Indians were the big losers, and Americans were now free to pour into the West. A good way to look at the War of 1812 is as the Revolutionary War Part 2. With their victory, American independence was secure, and the British would be forced to accept their loss of U.S. lands. On a side note, for a little trivia, the use of the nickname Uncle Sam started in the War of 1812 to represent the U.S. government. And politically, as a result of the war, the Federalist Party was pretty much finished. In the election of 1816, James Monroe, Madison's Secretary of State, won in a landslide, as the Federalists were seen as unpatriotic during the war. 4 years later, he ran virtually unopposed. And probably the biggest outcome of the War of 1812 was the United States' new standing on the world stage. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, America was seen as a global power. In 1823, Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, would draft the Monroe Doctrine, warning all European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. And that's where we'll pick up next time with the Age of Jackson, where America's population and economic growth would explode in the following decade, and politics would fall further into the hands of the American people. But before we do, let's review. What was the name of the wars that ravaged Europe from 1803 to 1815 that were led by France? The Napoleonic Wars. What was the hated practice of forcing sailors on American ships to join British ones called? Impressment. What party was against the war and voted against Madison in the election of 1808? The Federalists. What was the name of the Shawnee chief who led the campaign against white settlers in Ohio? Tecumseh. What was the name of the battle against Tecumseh's gathering of Native Americans at Prophetstown? Tippecanoe. What future president led the attack at Tippecanoe? William Henry Harrison. What were the congressmen such as Henry Clay who supported the war called? The War Hawks. What were the causes of the U.S. declaration of war on Britain? Impressment, the Native American attacks in the West, and interference in our trade. What three fronts did most of the fighting take place on? Canada, the Atlantic, and the South and Southwest. What Great Lake did Americans capture? Lake Erie. What did the British do when they attacked Washington, D.C.? Well, they burned the White House and the Capitol. The British bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore led to this man writing this song, Francis Scott Key and the Star-Spangled Banner. What was the name of the peace treaty signed that ended the war? The Treaty of Ghent. Who was the hero in the Battle of New Orleans, which took place after peace had already been declared? Andrew Jackson. What were 4 of the outcomes of the War of 1812? Now, I've listed 5, but there's definitely more than that. Well, the Native Americans lost, and Western expansion would explode after this. U.S. independence was secured. The Federalist Party were pretty much done, and the U.S. was now seen as a global force, exemplified by the Monroe Doctrine some 10 years later. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because up next we are going to look at the Age of Jackson. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of resources such as worksheets, smartboard activities, guided notes, Kahoots, lesson plans, quizzes, and more are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Click the link in the notes below this video or go to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Thanks again for watching, guys. Keep up that good work, and you are going to ace that next test you got.